Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon and good morning from whichever side of the world you currently are. I hope everybody is safe and healthy. My name is Sapura Hijriana, and I am delighted to be hosting today's event. The Honorable Bapak Arif Wibisono Lubis, Ph.D., Vice Dean for Academic, Research, and Student Affairs, Faculty of Economics and Business, Universitas Indonesia. The Honorable Bapak Zafri Husodo, Ph.D., Head of Postgraduate Program in Management, Faculty of Economics and Business, Universitas Indonesia. The Honorable Professor Susan Ainsworth, Associate Dean for Research, Faculty of Business and Economics, the University of Melbourne, Australia. A distinguished guest, ladies and gentlemen, warmest greetings and welcome to the guest lecture, Publishing Qualitative Research.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much, Sephora. That was quite the introduction. I feel very honoured. What I might do is I might share my.
Susan. Huh? Susan, Sephora needs to introduce the full host.
Sorry.
That's okay. Okay, continue, Sephora.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, this guest lecture is organized by Postgraduate Program in Management, Department of Management, Faculty of Economics and Business, Universitas Indonesia, and Research Cluster for Organizational Transformation, People and Society, Universitas Indonesia. Allow me to quickly introduce our research cluster. The Research Cluster for Organizational Transformation, People and Society, or COPS, was established in 2021 for our students, early career, as well as more established researcher within FEBUI and beyond who share an interest in developing and applying qualitative, interpretive, interdisciplinary, and emancipatory methods in the study of organizations and its complex environment. The cluster also holds regular seminars and exchanges, providing opportunities for academics and students to engage with a variety of partners. Now, I would like to invite Bapak Arif Wibisono Lubis, Ph.D., Vice Dean for Academic Research and Student Affairs, to deliver his remark as well to officially open today's agenda.
Thank you very much, Sakura, right? So good afternoon, Professor Ainsworth. Thank you very much once again to provide your time to give a talk on qualitative research this afternoon. Good afternoon to all of you, ladies and gentlemen. Very well to all of you to this qualitative.
Kayaknya putus-putus ya.
For organizing this event. So one of the missions of Faculty of Economics and Business Universitas Indonesia is to contribute to the knowledge development in economics and business. And this is translated by production.
Oke, putus-putus lagi ya kayaknya Pak Arif. Pak Arif kalau bisa dengar mungkin matiin videonya. Kelempar ya. Oke, kita tunggu sebentar ya. I think Arif will come back, Susan. We just wait for him. Okay, thank you. Okay, Pak Arif. I don't see Pak Arif, and probably he has some connection issues. So I think we're gonna continue ya, Safura ya. Thank you so much to Pak Arif ya, udah for giving his welcoming remarks.
Okay, thank you, Parith. Sorry, ladies and gentlemen, for the inconvenience. So,
Sorry
today's-
about that. So I'm back, by the way.
okay.
Sorry about the interruption because of the really poor connection. So I don't know whether I should finish my opening. I'm sorry, Professor Ainsworth, about this. Do I need to finish my opening or?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
Okay, sorry. Sorry. So sorry. I will try to open my camera. So I hope this works now. Okay. So I think I have already mentioned about the missions of Faculty of Economics and Business, and to translate this mission into practice. So basically, this is translated into the production of intellectual contributions, including academic research by the faculty of Economics and Business Universitas Indonesia. And as part of our research university, of course, continue to increase the quality and quantity of academic research. And nowadays, roughly, I can say maybe around 80% of the research produced by our faculty members and also our students still rely on a quantitative-based approach. We, of course, encourage the application of qualitative research by our faculty members and students in their research because we value multiple approaches in conducting different studies, because we believe that these methods can complement each other and provide holistic, comprehensive view in understanding certain issues in business and economics. Of course, this workshop is really in line with the mission of FEBUI, and therefore we fully support this workshop, and we hope that all of you can take the most benefit of this workshop. Once again, thank you very much and enjoy the workshop. Thank you very much. I would like to return back the floor to Safura.
Thank you, Pak Arif. So, ladies and gentlemen, today's topic will be about publishing qualitative research, delivered by our distinguished speaker, Professor Susan Ainsworth from Department of Management Marketing, Faculty of Business and Economics, the University of Melbourne. And this session will be chaired by our distinguished moderator, Bu Kanti Pertiwi, Ph.D., Head of Cluster for Organizational Transformation, People and Society, Faculty of Economics and Business, Universitas Indonesia. But first, let me introduce to you Bu Kanti. Bu Kanti Pertiwi is an assistant professor in the Department of Management, University of Indonesia, and the head of research cluster of Organizational Transformation, People and Society at Faculty of Economics and Business, Universitas Indonesia. She obtained her PhD from the University of Melbourne, Australia in 2017. She is interested in topics related to, and her works have appeared in many academic journals, such as the Journal of Business Ethics, Organization, Administrative Sciences, and others. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving the warmest welcome to our moderator today, Bu Kanti Pertiwi, PhD.
Ya, oke. Terima kasih, Safura. Thank you, Safura. Okay, so today's topic needs no further explanation. Yeah, publishing qualitative research, and I will be your moderator. But before we begin, I would like to quickly introduce Susan Ainsworth, our main speaker for today's seminar. Okay, Susan Ainsworth is a professor in the Department of Management and Marketing at the University of Melbourne, Australia. As you can see on your screen there, she uses critical, constructionist, and discursive approaches to understanding work and organizations, and specializes in qualitative research. Her current research interests include gender, age, and employment, work-based identities and the impact of new technologies on work. Before becoming an academic, she worked in industrial relations, equal employment opportunity, and human resource management in the public and private sectors. And she has published in a range of highly ranked journals, organization studies, human relations. You can see it on your screen. And she now serves on the editorial boards of the Journal of Management Studies, Organization Studies, Qualitative Research in Organizations and Management, and Gender, Work, and Organization. There's also Susan's email on the screen if you want to take note of that. So as I said earlier, our topic today does not require any explanation. So I'm just gonna welcome Professor Susan Ainsworth. Over to you, Susan.
Thank you. And I just note that that photo you just saw was taken pre-pandemic. So if I'm looking a little different, that's why.
I'm gonna have to spill my secret. My photo was from 2015. So.
Okay, I think that was 2019. So anyway, that's okay. Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for the invitation. I'm just going to share my screen because I've got some slides. I hope this is okay and everyone can see it. I've just sent Kanti PDF version of the slides, so you can get the slide pack as well. So thank you everyone for coming, and thank you for your interest in this topic. There were some things that I was going to plan to cover, and I'm not sure where people are at in terms of thinking about using qualitative research, or whether they've already started to do it, where they are in their sort of progress. But I think what I've tried to do is make this accessible for anyone, even those just thinking about starting out. So I'm just going to, so my plan for this session was to talk about some different approaches to qualitative research. And I think there's some things here that are important to know, regardless of what type of qualitative research you're doing or where you're at. So then I wanted to cover some challenges in qualitative research. So understanding that, you know, there might be some things you need to watch out for in terms of presenting, how to show and how to explain what you've done to various audiences. And then the challenges in presenting and publishing qualitative research. So here I'm going to go into some details about how to think about preparing your work for publication, which you may or may not be thinking about yet, but regardless, I think it's probably a good idea to have some idea about what to look for, because it might impact on how you actually approach the research to start with, how you design it. So the first thing to say is that there's a wide variety of methods of qualitative research, and I've listed some here. I have some experience in most of these. I haven't done ethnography, so that's not something I do, but I've done everything else. And when we say methods, we're really talking about ways of generating, collecting, and analysing data. The most common there is interviews. So that's the most commonly used form of method, though interviews can be part of a case study, or the transcripts of interviews might be text that you work on for discourse analysis, for example. But just generally, I think it's useful to use interviews to illustrate some of the differences between perspectives on qualitative research. So I'm going to do that as we go through. Before we even get into this sort of stuff, I want to sort of take a step back, and I want to ask some questions about, before we even think about what methods we propose on using, though that's important, ways of collecting, analysing, generating data. Some other more fundamental questions. And while these might seem a bit abstract, I think it's important to understand where you sit, where you're locating yourself and your research in relation to others, in terms of the assumptions you're making about when you want to undertake qualitative research, as well as knowing what the other options are open to you. And it will also help you to interpret and analyse other people's work and understand why their approach might differ from yours. So this will help you to explain what you've done. It will also help you to know what people to emulate or copy or learn from, and how also to defend and explain what you've done. So there's 4 basic questions there, and I'm going to go through each one. But basically, it's what methods, what methodology covers our choice of methods and research design, what theoretical perspective lies behind the methodology, and then what epistemology informs this theoretical perspective. So what's our theory of knowledge? What assumptions do we make about what's possible to know about the world? I took this from a chapter from Crotty, who I've actually included a little reading list at the end from all the references that I've cited in the presentation. And this is the foundations of social research, meaning and perspective in the research process. And it's the first chapter. So I'm just going to go over a couple of things from this chapter. And the reason that I take this from Crotty is because when I was doing a PhD, I came back from working in organizations. I came back into a PhD program, and I was confused about the sort of approaches there were. I didn't understand how they all related to each other, why people were using different terminology. And I came across this book. I think it was published in 1998. I think I came across it in 1999, maybe 2000. And I thought it was helpful to me in terms of trying to understand the variety of approaches that were out there and how they related to each other, and also what different levels terms were at when people started talking about, objectivism or post-positivism, trying to untangle all of that and bring some order to that. So that's the reason that I'm taking it from this chapter, which I think you might be able to get a copy of from Kanti. So just a few definitions. So methods, we've talked about methodology, theoretical perspective. It includes your ontology, so assumptions about the nature of reality, and then epistemology. What's your theory of knowledge? What can be known about the world and reality? And what can you know on the basis of your research? What knowledge claims can you make? He also depicts it like this in terms of a hierarchy. So epistemology, theoretical perspective, methodology and methods. So what theory of knowledge are you using? What can be known about the world and the phenomenon you want to investigate? What theoretical perspective are you using? And being specific about what that is. Are you assuming that interviews can give an objective reality on someone's world, or are you trying to explore the meaning people make in interviews? And then your methodology and your methods. So how are you going to operationalize this theoretical perspective, and what are you going to use in terms of collecting and analyzing data? Now, this is the table from this chapter that I found particularly helpful when I was a PhD student. This. And if you read the chapter, he goes through and unpicks these sorts of choices. But even though I might draw it differently now, and even though I might put different things in different sort of columns, it did help me to untangle all the different variants and put them in some order so I could see how they might relate to each other and what things are at the same level. So it helped me understand that if I was talking about, for example, interpretivism, so in that second column, that wasn't at the same level as constructionism or objectivism. That was at a more basic level. And then even if I was going to choose interpretivism, I could do that, but I could operationalize that in different sorts of methodology with different sorts of methods. So I'll leave you to read through that chapter, but as I said, I found it helpful and you might too. Anyway, let's come back to interviews, which is the most common method, I think, for generating data for qualitative research. And it's one choice of a methodology. So it's one choice of a research design. The key thing I wanted to illustrate through talking about interviews was that they can be undertaken from different theoretical and epistemological perspectives. So just three broad ones. You can undertake interviews And you can do it from the perspective that you think that if I talk to someone in an interview, I can gain knowledge of their reality. I can gain knowledge of an objective reality that they have experienced and take it as truth. And if I'm approaching it from that perspective, then things are going to be of concern to me, like minimizing researcher influence on the interview or bias. So I'm going to be concerned that I, as the researcher, don't intrude or influence the sort of responses that the interviewee gives. Now, that's quite different than this. So they call it romanticists, but I see this quite a lot in consumer research, where the interviewers are trying to get close to the interviewers. They're not stepping back and pretending they can remain neutral. They're trying to develop rapport. They're trying to understand and represent the interviewee's authentic experience of their world and their inner self and their views. And another perspective, again, is localists. So interviews are a social interaction in and of themselves. They're a context for, the creation of knowledge. They're co-constructed between interviewer and interviewee. You can use interviews to provide insights into how people construct meaning, how they interpret their world, and how they give an account or an explanation to the world to interviewers about what's going on. But they wouldn't seek to attempt to draw conclusions about what is really going on in the world. So they'd be studying people's explanations, people's accounts, people's interpretations, but they wouldn't be going so far as to say, well, I can really know what happened to this person outside the interview. So that contrasts with that first one. So we can see already that the same method can be undertaken from different theoretical perspectives, and it affects where you publish, it affects the sort of people you connect with in terms of different academics, the sort of academic conversation you're trying to join, and the knowledge claims you're making for your research. Okay, so now related to that, in terms of challenges in qualitative research, one of the things I just wanted to touch on was that there are different quality criteria that apply to qualitative research. So you may have heard of things like reliability, objectivity, validity, generalizability from a positivist, neo-positivist quantitative research sort of perspective. Those in general don't apply to qualitative research unless it's undertaken from the same sort of positivist perspective. So qualitative researchers have come up with a different range of quality criteria that people can use to judge, is this good qualitative research or not? As is typical for qualitative research, there isn't one set of quality criteria. There are different varieties and different versions. But basically, you shouldn't be trying to map qualitative research onto the criteria that are used for quantitative research. So it's like trying to compare apples and oranges or fit a square peg in a round hole. I'm not quite sure what the equivalent would be in Bahasa, but you probably get the idea, right? It's not the same thing. So that's important to know because it helps you to think about how you present your work, how you convince others of the quality of your work, and how you defend and explain your work if it comes under, criticism or review from others who perhaps don't understand that different quality criteria apply. So here are some that I've taken, and I've been involved in this sort of process back and forth with reviewers about a paper, probably about, I don't know, a year, 18 months ago. So I'm just going to talk about that in a minute. And it's also an example of interdisciplinary research. But here are some different quality criteria I picked out. And in brackets is the rough equivalent, even though I've just said we shouldn't be doing that, the rough equivalent for quantitative positivist research. So instead of validity, it's, is it plausible, credible, or authentic? So the explanation, the interpretations that the qualitative researcher provides of the findings. Is it transferable? So here we're not trying to generalize to a population, but what we are suggesting, and I'll talk about this in a little more, I'll take generalizability and also validity and unpack them a little bit more. Can the findings be transferred to other settings by researchers? Have you given them enough information to be able to make that assessment? Or is it theoretically generalizable? And sometimes this is called analytic generalizability. So does it provide new insights on categories of understanding that could apply to that phenomenon of interest? And I also sent through a chapter, the first chapter from a book by Seal called The Quality of Qualitative Research, that will provide you with some, introductory information about this sort of stuff. Instead of reliability, we might think about, is it dependable? So can we reasonably assume that this is a credible reflection of what the interviewers have said? Is it confirmable? Could I repeat this? Do I know enough from the method, from the information that's been provided, that it could be confirmed? And sometimes, though not all the time, depending on the sort of research you're undertaking, is it useful? Is it useful to the participants? Is it useful to the community in which the research was done? So I just thought I'd take a couple of examples and unpack it. So generalizability. So instead of that, we're looking for things like transferability. Is there enough thick description or detail of the context in which the research was undertaken to allow other researchers to assess whether the research insights could be transferred into other settings? So that's a different sort of criteria, a different sort of bar for quality. And like I said, there's also theoretical transferability. Are the analytic categories or findings of the broad class of phenomena, are they typical of the broad class of phenomena to which the theory refers? In other words, can you find the generic and the particular? Could the various practice or findings be possible in other settings? So here are some ideas that people have offered when they've been discussing, well, what does this mean for us in qualitative research? What are some of the alternatives to this idea of generalizability in quantitative research? And the second example I wanted to take was validity. And this really concerns the relations between the concept and the observations that are supposed to represent those concepts. So that's internal validity. Is it actually measuring what the construct is supposed to measure? In qualitative research, we'd think about, okay, so are the claims you're making, the analytic claims, credible? Do they clearly relate to the theoretical concepts that you've covered? And have you considered any deviant cases or any cases that are opposing and thought through the implications of that? One of the ways you can practice validity is to do participant or member checks. So for the people you've interviewed, for example, you can provide summaries or transcripts of the interviews or summaries of your findings back to them and say, is this actually reflective of your views and experience? Are you validating that what I've arrived at in terms of an interpretation of what you said is valid? So that's just some examples, and you can read some more about that. But in general, this is why I've been through these different points, and while they might seem a little bit theoretical and abstract, it's important to understand where you sit, because when people are assessing the quality of qualitative research, it really is going to depend on the epistemology, that the theory of knowledge that you're operating from, the theoretical perspective that you're operating from, and the methodology you've adopted. And it's important for us to understand that even though some standards of quality seem to be universal because they've become dominant, they've become mainstream, they've become the standard against which everything else is judged, they're still the product of a particular research community. It's just that that research community has been very dominant for very long. And so we've sort of forgotten that it's actually related to a particular community rather than a universal truth. So criteria for quality develop within particular research or epistemic knowledge communities. And so it's important for you to think, okay, who do I want to speak to with my research? Put another way, it's what academic conversation do you want to join? So imagine, you've been doing reading about a particular topic and you've come across a few authors whose work resonates with you, with what you want to do. And imagining that there's a big conference and there's a whole range of people there who have written on this topic. Which group of researchers would you like to go up to and start breaking into their conversation? Imagine they're having a conversation within their own tribe, if you like, of how to do research around this particular issue. Who would you like to speak to? Now, that conversation can happen in journals. So people publish research, other people cite that research, and there's a sort of academic conversation that is generated through publishing. It can also happen in conferences, it can happen at streams of conferences, but I think it's a really important point to think, okay, who do I want to speak to? Put another way, what's the 3 to 5 key academic papers that you really want to connect with in your research? So how do you narrow that down? Okay, I want to talk a little bit about interdisciplinary research because it has its own challenges. And I think we're all being encouraged to do more interdisciplinary research, and certainly the challenges that are facing the world demand interdisciplinary responses. And so you might find yourself involved in an interdisciplinary team. It's important to understand that even if members of your team are doing the same style of research, different disciplines have different ways of undertaking it and different ways of writing about it. And it's good to surface that up because you can go along assuming everyone has the same understanding of what you're doing, and then you find out, hang on a minute, they write in a different way, or they write in a different format, or they have a different approach to actually undertaking interviews and the analysis. Some theoretical perspectives are more common in some academic disciplines than others. In education, for example, phenomenology is very popular, whereas in management, I would say it's far less common. It's certainly a related sort of paradigm or a perspective, but it's just interesting to me how there are path dependencies in terms of how fields develop and how certain theoretical perspectives get institutionalized and others don't. I think that's why in interdisciplinary research teams, it's really good to have explicit conversations about how you're going to undertake the research and how it's going to be written up to surface up those assumptions. The other thing is that if you want to publish from interdisciplinary research, most journals, not all, but most, are still discipline-based. So it may involve making choices about how you frame what you've done for this particular journal in this discipline. And even though it's the same research you're writing from, it might end up looking quite different if you publish in, I'll take a live example, the Journal of Occupational Health versus the International Journal of Human Resource Management. Same research team, but representatives on that research team from mental health nursing, from social work, and from management. and different writing conventions and different journal conventions apply. So this is the project that I was going to use as a bit of an example to talk through. Oops. Okay. Sorry. So this is the outcome of that project. So I was invited to be involved in a project on mental health consumer workers, which I didn't know anything about. So I was invited onto this by people in social work, our social work school, which is part of a different faculty, and mental health nursing. And just in brief, consumer workers, there's a phenomenon in Australia where people who have been users of mental health services, public health services, can be employed to provide service to other mental health users. So they're previous patients or clients who now work with current patients and clients. But there's all sorts of problems they experience because they're going into an already established, very medically based mental health care, and they're often marginalised. So that was the sort of position we were coming from. In this paper, this is actually mixed methods. So this is an example of qual and quant. I was involved in the survey, but I wasn't involved in doing any of the analysis of the survey, but certainly of the interviews, the interview data. And just a couple of challenges we faced when we were trying to publish this. So this is the first publication from this project. So research on mental health, mental illness tends to be dominated by quantitative, positivist and biomedical paradigms, perspectives. Research on human resource management also tends to be dominated by quantitative, positivist perspectives. All right, so we're trying to publish on mental health in a human resource management journal, and they're both dominated by positivist quantitative methods and perspectives. And here we are coming in with a mixed method, but qualitative research and an approach to the research design, which is called co-production. And it's not known in HRM. So the other thing is working with non-academics in the project team. So part of the idea of this research approach is to involve the people who are affected by the research in the research design and the doing of the research itself. That's why it's called co-production. It's also an explicitly critical theoretical perspective. So here there's a challenge to the assumptions of positivism that you can be objective or that that's desirable, and that the researcher should be separate to the researched and that the research is neutral. So that there are a lot of things going on in this, in trying to get this paper published is what I'm trying to say. I'm going to just see if I can share with you. Let me just try another share screen. Just bear with me. Here we go. Okay, here we are. I'll try and make that a bit bigger. I went through this paper just before, and it was interesting to me because I was looking through, I remember what I had to do to respond to the reviewers. So I was the one who was from human resource management or management. And so it was up to me to try and frame this up in a way that would speak to human resource management audience. And so when we were going through this process, I remember trying to respond to reviewers and also explain to reviewers why it was valid to adopt a critical approach that actually involved consumer workers in the process, because we were getting criticised for things like bias, that we weren't neutral. And yet that was part of the point of the theoretical perspective we were adopting, is that you do take on the perspective of those that have been disadvantaged through these practices. And so I'm not sure if you can access this through your university library, but if you have a look at this paper, you can see places where I've explicitly taken this on. So I'm saying, okay, that might be standard academic practice, but it's problematic from the perspective that we're adopting, because we are adopting an explicitly emancipatory ethic. And we are explicitly adopting a critical disability studies theoretical lens. So if you read through that, you'll see me directly taking on the criticism of bias, of researcher neutrality. We're saying it doesn't pretend to be value neutral. It questions whether neutrality and objectivity are even possible or desirable, particularly in research about the experiences of groups that have been systematically disadvantaged. So I just wanted to point that out to you, is that this is the sort of thing that you need to do, and this is you may be called on to do. And that's why it's important to know where you're located in terms of those different critical perspectives, theoretical perspectives, and the sort of approach you're bringing to the research. The other thing I'd say is, and I'll get to this a little later on, is we were bringing a research approach that was really unknown for this audience. And so what we had to do was explain it, because they didn't understand what we were doing. So here we have method. And you'll see me saying the research paradigm we employed in this study wants some explanation, as it's not often found in literature on HR, employment, and mental illness. And then going on to say what it is, that it shares explicit moral and political goals to improve current situations, how it differs from traditional positivist research. And then I go into quality criteria. Criteria used to judge the quality of this type of scholarship differ from those used in positivist inquiry because of their divergent ontological and epistemological assumptions. Validity, I talk about what validity means. I talk about how to do validity from this perspective. So I just wanted to share that example with you because it was fairly recent, and it shows how you can leverage that understanding. If you have an understanding of where you sit and being able to interpret what reviewers are saying to you about your own research and being able to answer back, and being able to explain that to an audience, then that is going to really help you in the publishing process and actually in the presenting process. Okay, let's go on. I like this quote. There's probably rules for writing the most persuasive, memorable, and publishable qualitative research article, but rest assured, no one knows what they are. But that was 2004. Certainly some people have come out with things that are almost like templates. I suppose I'd caution people from following those too closely, because I think templates can be informative, but so can just reading research articles and seeing how other people have done it and seeing whether that would work for your material and your project. So this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to find our tribe, right? And when I say tribe, I mean people who share our sort of perspective and what we're trying to do. So a tribe is really about sharing the norms and the conventions for undertaking qualitative research and presenting it. And regardless of what you do, you'll find a tribe out there. One of the ways that you can do it is to find examples or really good articles of the type of research that's published in the sort of journals you want to publish in. So where would you like to publish? And then what sort of articles have you read that you think that's a really good article? I'd really like to be able to do stuff like that. Okay, so make a note of that, because those are the sorts of things that will be your reference point and your beacon in trying to find your way through this. So in terms of presenting qualitative research, there's a few things here, a few events, I suppose, that where you're called on to do that. It might be you submitting to a journal, it might be going to a conference, or it might be you submitting your thesis for examination by external reviewers. You can become your own critical reader or reviewer. And I've given an appendix of questions you can ask yourself to try and help you along that process. But in brief, for your own work, you can start to step back from it and ask key questions that help you to assess how ready am I to present this work, what still needs some further development. So I've taken this from Gephardt. Just some key questions to ask yourself. Have you drawn on all the relevant literature? Because that's one of the key things that people will be looking for. Or are there gaps? Have you engaged with that literature? Have you clearly specified a research gap and question? So what is motivating your study? What's the knowledge gap that you're trying to address? What's left to know? What is known to date from the research that's been published, and where is the space that you're going to target? How are you going to add to knowledge? And showing how that arises logically from your literature review. So some of this are questions of how to structure your paper and how to write your paper. Have you explained why you're using a particular methodology given the research questions you've identified? And you've in that example I just talked about, you've seen places in that article where I really went into detail, explicit detail about, okay, you want to know about this? I'm going to tell you about this. Who's your audience? And are they likely to be familiar or supportive of your methodology? So in that case of that article, they were not familiar with the methodology and they probably weren't supportive of it. But you can still get through that process. You can still convince. Is your use of particular methods consistent with your theoretical framework and underlying epistemology or ontology? So that's one of the things that people will look for. For all the choices you've made, are they lining up? So if you've come out and you've said, well, I'm taking an interpretive theoretical perspective and I'm going to do it via interviews, and then at the end you come out making claims that you can know what is happening to people out in the world outside the interview, I'd be saying, hang on a minute, you're out of whack, because you can't possibly make that claim to knowledge based on the theoretical perspective that you've just identified or stated that you're following. So it's about making sure that there's consistency throughout the article, throughout the paper. In terms of looking to publish, one of the things that I think is really important is journal fit. And it's one of the reasons that people will get rejected from journals. And that is, have you done your research on the journal? Is this the best journal? Is this the most appropriate journal for the work that you are submitting? And it may not be a reflection on the quality of your work. It may be that perhaps you've chosen the wrong journal to try and publish in. So there are things you can do to make sure you try and avoid that outcome. And you're sort of doing research on the journal itself. So identifying, okay, what journals would I like to publish in? First of all, what am I reading? So what articles am I reading and where are they published? What articles am I drawing on? That would be a logical first place to look in terms of where you wanted to publish. For any journal, what sorts of things do they publish? What sorts of research do they publish? How do people write for that journal? How do they structure their papers? What are the conventions of that journal? What sorts of qualitative research is published in it? What sort of methods do they use? How do they present it? How do they discuss it? And then thinking about, okay, I really want to locate my work in that journal. So what work has appeared in that journal that I can cite? So how can I frame my work in a way that I'm joining a conversation that is already going on in that journal? I'm contributing to a conversation that has already is taking place, that the groundwork's been laid. So one of the easy ways to do that is to go through and do a search for any papers that is appearing in that journal or journals that are relevant to your work, and thinking through how you can use them, how you can leverage them, how you can work them into your argument, so that you're showing that, yes, this is a paper that is suited for this journal, should be appearing in this journal, because I'm building on what people have already done. In terms of giving yourself the best chance, think about presenting it at a conference, a workshop, or a seminar. That could be an internal seminar. It could be a conference, also either an open conference, or lots of conferences now have doctoral workshops attached or paper development workshops attached. There might be specific publishing workshops run by particular journals around the world. Think about whether you'd benefit from having a co-author or a more experienced co-author. I'm not saying you should or shouldn't, but it's just something to think about. It's a really good idea if you can ask other people to read your work and give you feedback on it before you submit, and do the same for them. So this is the sort of collegiality that is going to really help build the culture and the research capability of the communities in which you are. When you think it's finished, leave it a week and go back. It's amazing how even papers that have gone through, I don't know how many versions, but maybe 20 at least. And then I read it and I pick up a typo and I go, I don't understand how I didn't see that, but it's there. So yeah, that's often a good idea. And of course, make sure you're conforming to the journal's house style. So even, you know, for things that are shared among journals, they're going to have their own particular ways of doing things, particular format for references or headings or whatever. And it's important to check that on the journal site. Let's assume that you've put something into a journal and you've got a revise and resubmit decision, which is a fantastic outcome. And that's the best outcome we can hope for. So what do you do now? And this is often a place where people get stuck, particularly if they're early on in their sort of publishing career, because you get back these reviews and it's about how do you make sense of them? How do you start work on them? How do you unpick the paper that you wrote and actually start to address these reviewer comments? So read the reviews carefully and highlight the major points. And Kanti knows that I've got a particular method of going through this process. We've been through it a couple of times already. And it's there's quite a lot involved, but it's very thorough and we've had success with it, I think. Read the editor's letter. So the handling editor is supposed to give you direction about what you must address in your revision. So you get reviews back, you might get 3 reviews back from different reviewers. But in addition to that, you should get a covering letter from the handling editor saying, this is the decision, pay particular attention to this, this, and this, and this, and then I'll let you read the reviews and address all their points. But what they're really doing is they're giving you a sort of steer in a direction of what are the really big things that you need to do. Now, I say they're supposed to do it. They don't always do that. And it's really frustrating when they don't, when they just basically say, yep, here's the reviews. As I said, that can be very frustrating because you're really left to work it out, in which case you need to use your own judgment. But basically, for every point that a reviewer is raising, you need to write a response. You need to either make a change, show them you've made the change, or explain why you're not making the change in a way that's respectful. I did this early on, which was a trap. So I'm just sharing that with you so you don't make the same mistake. And that is overreact and write a completely different piece. So you've submitted something, they've come back, they've said various things, and you've gone, oh, I have to change everything. And, you know, you've basically risked losing what was good about the first one. I'd also say that these sort of points also apply to examiners' reports. So you can also apply this to if you get your thesis back and there are reviewer comments or examiner comments where you have to make some changes.
Susan?
Yeah.
I see a very relevant question in the chat
Yes.
box. Should we address them now, or should we wait
Sure.
until the end of your presentation?
I was just going to go on and talk a little bit more about responding to reviewers, but let's just show the chat. So if I stop sharing.
No, that's fine. We can read it to you.
Okay.
Okay. From Pak Andi Wahyudi. Susan, I often got comments from journal editors that my paper is too descriptive. Could you please tell me how to present a good analysis in the paper for the journal?
Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Too descriptive, radio. So there, without knowing anything about the details of the paper, you may have presented findings from the research, but it's then what do you do with them? And here, it's really about what you do in the front section in the literature review. So identifying a research gap and a question, presenting findings that relate to that research gap and question, and then returning to it in the discussion and scaling up from the findings or the description to say, okay, so what? So I have these findings. How do they relate to the literature that I've previously reviewed? What's similar? What's different about it? Have I identified some new patterns? Have I identified more nuances? Have I identified that what people thought this is how it worked? Actually, I've shown, well, it doesn't always work like that. It plays out differently under certain conditions, whatever it was. But I'd say that's the sort of thing they might be referring to. So it's about scaling up from just presenting your findings to what you do with your findings in terms of what's the contribution to knowledge, what's the connection back to the literature you reviewed and the theory, the concept. So how do your findings relate to that, and what new ideas are you able to generate, or insights you're able to generate from that? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Pak Andi, do you have any further question, or is Pak Andi here? If he's happy to show himself. Okay, so we'll just leave it at that. No, that's okay. I mean,
I can see there's quite a few. I can see there's 8 or so comments in the chat. Did you want to go to questions?
That's the only question up until now. So you can continue with the slides. Yeah. Thank you.
No worries. I haven't got that much more to go, so there'll be time as well for questions and discussion. In terms of writing a response to reviewers, there's different styles, but all of them involve showing exactly how you responded to each comment and covering each point in a systematic fashion. So I was going to try and share an example of that as well. Let me see. Oh, here we go. Here it is. So this is from the same one. This is from the same paper that I showed before. So I'm just laughing. I'm just rereading it, right? I'm reliving this. So this is the first, I think this is the first round of reviews. So here I've got, this is what I've done. So this is the actual review. I've actually copied and pasted what they wrote, and then our response. What they wrote, our response. So you can see, I mean, you might think, well, that's overkill or that's really tedious, but what you're doing is you're making sure that you take every point that they raise and deal with it seriously, and that you're doing it in a systematic fashion, and that when it goes back to reviewers, they can see what you've done. So here, you'll remember I was pointing out the bit where I explicitly addressed issues of the quality criteria of qualitative research. So this was in response to this, partly in response to this comment. So the referee saying the context is unusual. It's, you know, it's so unusual that I'm not sure it's relevant, basically. That's certainly the generalizability of the findings becomes a bit challenging. So this is a reviewer that is not immediately understanding that we're coming from a different perspective. And so here's my response. Yes, it's atypical. In this revision, we try to explain what we hope to contribute. We also explicitly acknowledge we don't claim the findings are generalizable to general population in a statistical sense, but rather that they are transferable. And what that means, they provide insights that others could take up in further research. This is consistent with an interpretive paradigm where there are different criteria for judging quality to those that dominate a positivist approach. We explain the paradigm and theoretical lens we're adopting in much more detail in the method section, and I give them the page numbers so they can go directly there and see it. And we return to the status of the knowledge claims in the conclusion and the page number. So I'm signaling we've explained it, and the claims we're making at the end are consistent with that. So that's just one example, but if like that's 14 pages, that response to reviewers. So every comment, what we did, and you may not change, you may not do everything that the reviewers want, but if you don't do something they want, you have to explain why. And you're not just convincing the reviewers, you're convincing the handling editor. So that's, I just thought I'd share that with you because sometimes it might be hard to imagine what it looks like if you haven't seen one before, and how to approach it. Okay, so that's why I'm saying make it easy for them to see what you've done. Yes, I mean, this is an exercise in humility. Approach it as an opportunity to learn and be grateful for the time they've taken to review your work. So sometimes you can feel very, how do I say it? Despondent, despondent, defensive, all of those words when you get reviews back. And you can, you say they just don't get it or whatever else. Yeah, you may not agree with what they say. Even if you don't agree, the fact that the changes that you've made to explain and justify what you've done, the response that they've had will prompt you to improve your work. And so because of that, you'll inevitably end up with a better final piece, regardless of how you feel about them, regardless of how you feel about the validity of what they've raised. Just in the process of having to clarify and having to explain and having to justify and having to be really sure yourself that what you're doing is appropriate and justifiable, you will end up with a better piece of writing. So take heart. If you get a reject decision from a journal, don't despair because you're in good company. We all get rejected at some point. The only way to avoid rejection is never to send something in the first place. It's never to try. So I've certainly had rejections. So it certainly doesn't mean that the paper doesn't have any merit. Again, it might be an issue of journal fit. I would suggest leaving it for a few weeks or months to just let the dust settle on it and then revisit it. You, when you come to reread the editor's letter and the reviews, even if they have decided to reject the paper, they will probably have given you some really good feedback you can use to improve it. And I know some people who actually do this. They send their work off to really high ranked journals without really expecting that they're going to get a revise and resubmit, just to get the feedback from the journal about how they can improve it. Some people live by this mantra: every paper can find a home. It's just a matter of finding a home. I'm not sure about that. I have papers that have never found a home, but that's okay. It happens to most people. But as I said, you're in good company. Some other things you can do to develop your skills and your sense of judgment about these things that you can then use to apply to your own work: volunteer to review for journals and for conferences. Volunteer to review, be a reviewer. Journals are always looking for reviewers, because that way you learn what different journals are looking for and how they make editorial decisions. Because a lot of the journals will send you now, if you review for them, they'll send you a copy of the other reviewers' comments on the paper and also the editorial letter. So you can see, okay, I picked up these points. Looking at other reviewers, I can see they picked up the same or different things. I can see that the handling editor made a note of one thing I said, so you can get a sense of a better feeling for how those judgments are made. And it can help you to learn how to give constructive feedback, critically appraise other people's work, but also, as I said, you can then apply it to your own work. Even just in reading qualitative research articles, I mean, a lot of the time we just read for content in terms of what's relevant to my current research project, but you can read articles in terms of their form and the way they're put together and the way that they construct an argument. So you can actually step back and apply some of the questions and perspectives we've been talking about here to the article and analyze it from that perspective. So think through, okay, their methods and the way they collected the data, was that consistent with their sort of overall perspective they adopted? How did they justify using a particular method as opposed to another one? How did that relate to their research questions? How did they explain their methods? So how much space did they give to that? What did they say? How much context did they give to what they, to the research? How did they organize their findings and their results? How did this reflect their research questions and focus? So the question about the too descriptive. So the feedback you got from the journal about too descriptive, this is the sort of thing that they might be talking about. So how do you relate your findings back to the research question? Did you organize your results and findings in categories or themes that reflected the research question and the literature? This, how did you move from the presenting of the data to the discussion and conclusion? Did you scale up? Scale up from the findings to make more abstract and conceptual points. That's one of the ways of being analytical. And how did you link your data to your contribution? So you'll claim that you've made some original contribution to knowledge, to what we currently know about this particular topic, or the use of this method, or development of theory. So I've just provided a list of the references that I cited in the presentation itself there. And then in the back of the presentation, I've just done a little self-assessment checklist that you can use to compare with the work that you're doing, to sort of do a bit of a check about, have I actually got each part? Is it consistent? Have I done everything I'm supposed to be doing in a paper? And you can also use this to assess other people's work. So I'm going to leave it there. I realize that's probably a lot of information for one session, and I'm hopefully I've left enough time for questions. I think so.
Yeah, I think so. Hopefully, if it's okay, we go a little over. It's 5 o'clock here, so probably at your place around 8 o'clock something now, or
It's about 20 to 8, but I'm okay to stay a bit
okay,
longer. So yeah.
okay. So because I see there's one comment and also one question in the chat box.
Okay.
Okay, yeah. Okay, thank you for your inspiring presentation, Susan. It's interesting to collaborate with the more experienced author. This one is from Miranti Kartika Dewi. And my question is, from your perspective, what factors are typically considered by experienced researchers like you in taking someone to collaborate with? Thank you.
Oh, okay. So what is, okay. Okay. I don't know. Is the short and the long version of that one. I suppose it's whether you see potential in it, and whether it's an interesting, like it might be that it's a really interesting site of research, or it's a sort of data that perhaps is quite unusual, or something that isn't, that a lot of the journals aren't acquainted with. So it might be something quite novel or something unusual for that sort of audience. And I'm talking about, like, a lot of the academic journals are, they're dominated by English-speaking Western Hemisphere, Northern Hemisphere academics, right? So what they consider unusual is different than what we might consider unusual. But yeah, so I think it's probably the potential in the work itself. Like what do we see in that? I don't know, Kanti, what do you think about that question?
I think that makes sense. I think from what we've done with our research collaboration, it's about presenting a story that is less heard in the broader literature, the broader scholarship of a given topic. So yeah, probably that's one of the things that interest you in the first place. I think the uniqueness of the context. But I agree with the previous question. How do we avoid being just describing something, and not being analytical enough? And there was a comment from Kak Mone, from our department, Susan. He said that, going back to your earlier point, he got a major revision feedback, and then he revised it and then got rejected because it's a new, different paper now.
Probably like,
yeah, it's probably playing into that idea. You don't want to be descriptive. You're trying to be complicated, and then suddenly you create entirely new paper.
Well, yeah, see, this is the thing I was talking about, and that's the trap I fell into myself early on. Was I saw the reviews and I went overboard with how many changes I made, and I made it into something completely different. And they said, oh, it's like a new paper. So no. So I feel your pain there. I wouldn't abandon it though, because if you got a revise and resubmit decision, I mean, that's the best we can hope for, right? So you got a major revision feedback, you revised it, got rejected. Okay, the reviewer said it's a new, different paper. Okay, so where else can you send it? That would be my advice. Looking at the reviews, have they told you things that you can improve on? Looking at the two versions, and maybe I think this is where you can ask your colleagues or friends or peers to help you out. To say, can you read this version of the paper? Can you read that version of the paper? Which one do you think is the most interesting and has the most potential? To just give you a sense of what, which one to work with. It's possible to turn around, like if you get, I was looking through my my revise and resubmit responses to reviewers to find an example. And the most recent one had accepted in Human Resource Management Journal, which came out not that long ago. The original, that's the one that went through 3 rounds of revision. The original response, the original editor's letter, they didn't give us any steer on what to do, but they said it's a major revision and it's a high risk. So basically what they're saying is, we'll give you a revise and resubmit, but you need to understand that the chances of you successfully turning it around are not that high.
Oh, okay.
And, you know, we were still able to do it. It was painful and it took a lot of work, but it doesn't mean if you get that, it's necessarily dead in the water. If you can see that you can address it, then you can turn it around. Sorry, there's new messages here. I haven't quite.
Yeah, I see one participant raising hand. Should we address
yes
as well? So we go back from the chat box and then.
Sure.
Okay, so Mas Ade silakan. Mas Ade Pradipta, yeah.
Thank you, Kanti. And before I begin asking my question, I'd like to say thank you for FEB for conducting the amazing lecture, and thank you, Prof. Susan, for amazing lecture. It's very helpful, especially for me, because next week I'm gonna have to do my thesis defense.
Oh.
So thank you. My questions to you, I have 2 questions. Since you are you have many experiences in discursive studies, and I also do discourses analysis on water policy in Bali. So can you perhaps explain more or tell us a story from your experiences, what kind of challenges that you might face and how you deal with it, so that we can have a lesson from it? And the second question is, you mentioned before about gap dependency. It's in the interdisciplinary aspects of qualitative research, right? My question is, how do you do it? How do you find the path? Because in my case, I use systematic review articles so that I can know in which direction my study leads to, etc., etc. But do you have any other methods that we can learn from you? And is it enough to just use a systematic review articles? Because sometimes in the articles, my problem is that it is really focusing on in one aspect of in discipline. So it's very hard for me to find the common grounds if you would like to make an interdisciplinary study. For example, you need to merge the path, right? So yeah, that's my question. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Ade. I'm not quite sure if I caught the first question. So
challenges from your experience. Is it challenges relating to doing qualitative research, Mas Ade, atau
or discourse analysis?
Discourse analysis.
Oh, discourse.
Okay. Okay. Yep. How long have you got? What's the time? How long have you got? That's how long my answer could be. No, I'm joking. That was a bad joke.
It's a serious.
It's a bad joke. Yeah. Okay. So discourse analysis. Okay. When I first came back to uni, long story, but anyway, back in the day, my first degree was in English, literature and language. So I'd actually done discourse analysis when I was young, but I didn't know that's what it was called. And I went and worked and did other things. And I came back around to in this department that was looking at stuff to do with work and organizations. And I found these people who were doing something that looked a lot like or seemed a bit like what I used to do. They were calling it discourse analysis. And anyway, so that's how I came back into it. But one of the challenges I had early on was trying to understand how come your version of discourse analysis doesn't look like my version. So it was because people would seem to be talking at cross purposes, and they'd say things like, I remember presenting at a PhD forum and a visiting professor saying, you can't use interview data for discourse analysis. And I'm going, why not? Because Margaret Weatherall, who's one of the doyens of discursive psychology, uses interview data. And so there's this sort of weird sort of tribalism, you know, there are a lot of different traditions of discourse analysis that have their own sort of histories and stuff. So I think one of the challenges is, again, trying to locate your approach within those broader, you know, currents and understand where you sit in relation to things and how to explain what you do in relation to other things and who's doing the work, the sort of work that you're doing. So that's the sort of thing that I would advocate is if you're doing a very different style of discourse analysis than appears in this journal, Journal A, but you know that it does appear in Journal B, all other things being equal, I'd go with Journal B. Because here, you're going to be fighting uphill. There's more, you're making more work for yourself. It's going to be harder. Whereas here, you've already got an audience. You've already got a tribe. They're going to understand what you're doing. You're not going to have to justify as much. They're going to be speaking sort of the same language. So all other things being equal in terms of the status of the journal and everything else, I'd go with that. That's what I mean a bit like journal fit and finding your tribe and who you want to speak to, what audience you want to speak to, who do you want to join with your research. So sorry, I don't know what there was a systematic review articles question. So is that sufficient? I'm not really sure what sort of.
I think the question was, I think if I'm not mistaken, how do you find the right method for you? Was that your question, Mas Ade?
How do you find the right method?
Yes, more
Okay.
or less, yes.
It depends what research question. Depends what you want to find out. So if you want to find out, what effects, you know, wage increases have on the amount people spend on, you know, fast-moving consumer goods, you're not going to be using qualitative research to find that out. If you want to find out how people make sense of a particular experience, what sort of categories of meaning they use when they're trying to make sense of it, then I'd be saying you'd be doing something interpretive because that suits that sort of question. So I'd start with the research question. What is it that you actually want to explore? And then you're thinking, okay, so what's a suitable way of exploring that? Hopefully that makes sense.
Okay, thank you, Susan. Hopefully, yeah, terjawab ya, Mas Ade. Mudah-mudahan.
Just one more point about the interdisciplinary aspect. If you would like to tell me more about it.
Interdisciplinary?
Yeah.
Yeah, look, I think inevitably you have to choose, like, traditional academic outputs, like journal articles, typically appear in discipline-based journals. So I think even if you're doing interdisciplinary research, you have to make a choice of how you're going to frame up what you've done so it fits within a particular disciplinary frame. And that's the sort of thing with that International Journal of Human Resource Management one. So even though we were doing it on, you know, this mental health consumer workers, which didn't really have anything to do with human resource management, there was quite a bit of work to frame that in a way that it could find a home in that journal. Other members of the research team are writing for Journal of Occupational Health, and it's going to look quite different. So I think as long as you understand that interdisciplinary work is really rewarding and potentially very useful in terms of addressing a lot of challenges and problems, finding out about things. You're still going to have to do work to try and help it to fit a particular discipline in order to get an output. It's also an issue of grants. So if you apply for research grants, depending on the system in the particular country, I know in our system, people get caned, like they get slammed for if they're doing interdisciplinary work, because you're going to assessors who are discipline based and they just don't understand what you're trying to do. And they don't understand, they say you don't have a background in this and da, 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 da. So I think there are various pitfalls of doing interdisciplinary work. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it, but I think you need to do more work to then think through how to frame it for a discipline-based audience. Now, I can see some questions in the chat and I haven't even
oh yes, there are
started
two from Roro Damar. Do you want me to read it? Okay.
Yeah.
So this one, the first one, how important is it for a researcher to state what methodology they use in a research? I've come across two types of researchers, one that rigidly hold onto the methodology, whatever it brings to the research process, and the other one that avoids stating the methodology they use to avoid unimportant questions, since some methodologies are still under debate. What's your insight for this? And the second one, I think many Indonesian early researchers have problems in locating their research in a broader knowledge, as they're too focused on narrowly addressing their project while forgetting the what at stake part of the project. Do you have any suggestion for the researchers so they can escape their disciplinary box and offer discussions that would be useful for a broader and multidisciplinary audience? So the first one is about avoiding stating your methodology upfront. The second one is about advice to multidisciplinary researchers.
Okay, so without knowing the specific details of those examples of the two types of researchers, if I was going to take a guess, I'd say that the first type that's holding rigidly to the methodology might be someone who is trying to explain a relatively unknown methodology to an audience. So you're speaking to a particular group when you publish, the readership of that journal. And that journal, that readership, there'll be some things you can take for granted that they know, that they share in common. That's what I mean about epistemic communities. They're a knowledge community. There's things you can assume that they're going to agree with that you don't need to state. And then there's things that you're pretty sure they're not going to agree with or they don't know about, and you might have to state them quite obviously and explain them. So I think it would, what I'd like to know is a bit more about where this researcher's work appeared in, what the journal was, what the norms were for that journal. If you're going in and you're doing something that's quite different from that journal, then you will be needing to explain it more and more explicitly. But if I go and I publish in a journal and I can assume that everyone already gets it, gets what I'm doing, then I might cut back on the explanation. I don't know about stating the methodology they use to avoid unimportant questions, since some methodologies are still under debate.
So my sense is probably if we're writing to a journal which we know have a different stance to us, but we still want to publish there, but we don't want to trigger controversy and just get desk rejected. Is that a good idea to sort of hide your epistemological assumptions and approaches? And
see, I'm a little bit the opposite in that it's not possible to hide it. So what they'll probably accuse you of is not being clear in your epistemology and then following it through. So not being aligned. I'd actually be more inclined to, I'm not saying this for everyone, but I'd be more inclined to state it up front. So if you can anticipate that someone is going to criticize you for something because of what you know about, what they believe or what the journal publishes, I'd be more inclined to actually address that up the front in your first version of the paper and say explicitly, this is a different sort of research that has different sort of criteria, that is judged by different standards. This is what it's about. This is what it can add to our understanding of this phenomenon. So I'd be more inclined to actually be way more upfront about it and not challenging, but actually being open about it and
Susan,
saying,
if I may, probably I can add, that's my question. And
Yeah.
what I meant by an important question was that I come across, well, my own supervisor when I was doing PhD said that, well, I initially wanted to mention that I wanted to do like a case study thing, but then he said, yeah, no, you don't need to state that. You just need to say that this is a qualitative research, probably mentioning something about this is a constructivist perspective, then jump into the method. Because he assumed that everyone would understand what you're doing by, just mentioning that without boxing it. This is like the case study or this is a phenomenology, But then I met my friend and I mentioned that, and he said that, no, your research will not be valid at all because the methodology is very important for him and probably for the way in his campus do it. But then this is my question: how important is it actually to just state or box yourself in a certain methodology in order to make it valid in an academic way? Probably that might help make sense of my question. Thank you.
Yeah. I suppose I'm not. I'm sort of not a fan of retrofitting what you've done into a box, like not after the fact, then trying to put it into categories. That's not what I'm sort of suggesting, but I think it's being transparent about what you've done and why you've done it and what your reasoning was and what your assumptions were. So that to me is explaining, the research decisions you made, the style of research you did, the choices you made. I don't see any problem with mentioning case study. That's not controversial. But also, I don't see why not mentioning case study makes your research invalid. Like, I don't agree with that. So it might mean that, you need to add some stuff back into it about, this is a case study. This is what I mean. I mean, you can do interviews as part of a case study. Like, there's a bit of layering. Case studies can be made up of various other methods, right? And without knowing the specific discipline you're in, like, I don't want to comment too far or extend myself too far and make, comments that don't apply. But I don't see a problem with explaining it as a case study. But
Right.
Equally, I don't think it's a massive problem or makes your research invalid if you don't label it a case study.
All right.
I'm sure that's helpful, but anyway.
Yeah, it answers. Thanks.
And there's also the second question dari Mbak Roro ya.
Locating their research in a broader knowledge. Yep. What's at stake, part of their project. Okay. So what's at stake, meaning what's useful for a broader sort of public audience of the research, or as in public, as in policymakers, society,
well,
or
it is
academic audience?
That our paper is useful not only for our discipline, but also it's somehow useful although indirectly way, but it's somehow they other discipline or probably other audience outside our box, our discipline can get something from that. So it means that the discussion have to be multidiscipline, and but then that is a challenge because sometimes we are focusing too much on discussing the project or the thing that we deal with in the paper than how to expand it to be useful for everyone.
So I think it's sometimes helpful to think of writing different versions of research findings or different papers for different audiences. So I think it's quite hard to have one paper doing everything to speak to all audiences. So you might write a paper that is that fills all the criteria for your discipline, right? Or your thesis for your discipline for your examiners. And you've got that. Okay, on that basis, then you might want to write other things that speak to different audiences, and they might look quite different. You might come up with a version that is about trying to speak to policymakers about a particular issue, or you might write a version that's about speaking to the broader public, or write a version that's about trying to connect with a different discipline that also covers this particular research topic. So that would be my advice, would be to start thinking about what different things can I write from this one research project that will target different audiences, rather than thinking about how can this one paper do everything, speak to everybody.
All right, great. Thank you so much for the answer, Susan. And thank you, Mbak Kanti.
Thank you, Mbak Roro. Thank you, Susan. So can we continue now to
the
next question?
So pressure to publish in order to graduate. Yep. What strategy you could suggest? Is it okay if I and my supervisors submit to a low ranked journal? Okay. So I'm not familiar with the, the criteria that might be being applied to you and your thesis in terms of graduating. And I completely understand the need to be pragmatic about things. So, I mean, quite a few journals publish the time papers spend in revision, like they'll actually give you that information on their website, or the time from receiving the manuscript to the time of acceptance, so you can get an idea of that. Do you have some more insights on this, Kanti?
I think if Dea, do you want to turn on your mic if possible? If not, maybe I'm just going to speculate. If she's studying at UI, then that would probably mean you have a total of maximum 12 months to write your thesis as well as publish your article.
Oh, okay.
Which can be really tough, but this is newly introduced sort of policy. We're just starting out, like this is the first semester, if not the second. So we are feeling pressured, not only the students, but also the lecturers. And yeah, I think I agree with you. You just need to be pragmatic. If you really want to publish a good quality article, then you have to change to a longer term plan for that one.
So couple of things. How many papers?
Oh, just one for master students. They need to publish one.
So I wouldn't be using up your best stuff on that publication, right? You could do a methods paper. You could do a paper which was more, depending on what the topic was. I mean, there are some that just publish, that are sort of context or regional journals. I've published in journals like that, Pacific Affairs, for example. There are different sort of, I mean, it wasn't for that reason. the other thing, a question I'd ask is, do refereed conference proceedings count as a paper?
Not anymore as of last semester or this semester. No.
That was going to be my out, right?
I know.
Well, look, if that's the requirement, I can't think of any journals. I can't think of any journals that I would be publishing in or aspire to publish in that would give me a result within 12 months. It just doesn't happen, unfortunately. Okay, so then I'd be thinking, right, so what's available that might do that and might meet the criteria? What have I got that I can publish in there that's not going to cannibalize my best stuff? So you might already know from your thesis, you've got, you know, a really kernel of a really good idea. I wouldn't be wasting that on that publication. I'd be thinking about, okay, what's a second or third tier thing that, you know, well, might be an interesting story, but I would never think of sending to somewhere higher up because I don't think it's got enough in it or whatever else. You know, I sort of be making those sort of strategic decisions. It's an unfortunate position to be in, though. I think they should review that decision because I think it's not helping, like, and it's unrealistic because of the time it takes for publishing. It just takes time.
Yes, that's true. We absolutely agree with you on that. I think most of us here would agree with that. Okay,
Data collected in a non-English context.
Yeah, from Kak Mone. Yeah, what kind of challenges you face in the context of publishing it?
Yep. I think it's just I don't think it's the non-English as in the language itself. I think it's explaining enough about the context. It's so that people understand the meaning that's being conveyed. So normally, you know, the language would be translated, but translations by themselves are very limited in terms of the meaning that they convey if you don't give enough contextual information, if you know what I mean. So it's about trying to convey to a reader unfamiliar with the context enough about the setting of the research and the factors at play that they can make sense of even the English translation and the significance of what people are saying. I don't know. Kanti, what do you think?
Yes, I think that can be a challenge, but also the more exciting part of presenting your findings, which will be like coming from a largely underrepresented setting in the broader scholarship. Writing about Indonesia and trying to explain the Indonesian context can be a challenge, but it can also be rewarding, I think.
I've got another PhD student whose interviews were in Hindi.
Okay.
Conducted in rural India.
Okay, interesting.
And is really trying to speak to a European audience and connect with a European sort of Anglo, you know, American literature and directly addressing, you know, putting the context front and center, not just as a setting for where the research was done, but trying to argue that for all the theories and ideas that come out of Western academia, that they come from somewhere, and it's people assuming that if it comes from a Western institution that somehow it's universal and it can be applied anywhere. But if you come up with research in a you know, in a context like an India or Indonesia, you have to justify why it's relevant and interesting to a you know, European or American audience. So try to directly address that rather than step around it or dance around it. That's not a tactic for everyone. I'm just sharing that with you.
Can I ask a more technical question?
Sure.
Ya, silakan kamu.
Yeah. So for example, we have data in Indonesia. So should we translate the data first to English, for example, before we are doing the coding, or we just translate everything at the end? So what do you suggest?
I would tend to do the analysis in a home language first. I suppose the reason I'm saying that, and maybe it's coming from my sort of perspective where I'd be looking at categories of meaning. So I think categories of meaning are internal to the language. Like you learn a language, but you learn a language, you learn a worldview, you learn a perspective on, you know, how things relate to each other. It's not just the words. So from that perspective, I'm thinking maybe categories of meaning, coding in the home language. But then if you've looked at the literature and you've got some concepts, and the literature might be from different countries, then you might need to sort of fit it onto the data that you've got in that language. Do you know what I mean? I'm trying to think about something like an example like individual decision making. And in a different setting, that whole concept may not make sense within that language and within that worldview, because individuals may not make decisions in the way that, you know, that's assumed. They actually, it's a group decision, or it's a decision that always takes into account other people, or the relationships with other people, or how doing that particular action is going to disturb the social system. And I think it might depend a bit on what you're actually looking at. Can you tell me a bit more about it? About what your actual project is?
Yeah, we're doing a research project about Kartu Prakerja. It's like the government provide a fund for unemployed person to develop their skills. Yeah, so they're more workable. Yeah, and I think, but in general, I found some difficulties in like how to translate or how to find the terminology in English that really fit with the local context. That's the biggest challenge that I face in this situation. So that's why maybe should we translate the interview transcript first before we are doing the coding, for example. So that's what I'm thinking about it. Yeah, that's just one example. Another one is I am doing research in employer branding, and again the concept is clear. The theory is already there, but I found some interesting. But how just to put it in English? That's the biggest challenge that I face right now.
Yeah. Yeah. So some things aren't easily translatable.
Yes, that's correct.
And when you translate them, it's sort of like you need all of the context around it to make sense of it, is what I suppose what I was trying to say before.
Yeah. So before we come up with the finding, I know that we should provide like maybe the reviewer will ask how you are doing the coding, Excel coding or whatsoever, and then what should be provided. Is it fine if we provide like let's say you suggest to put everything in English at the end, then the codings is Indonesia, but we cannot provide in Indonesia, right? For the reviewer, for example. That's my concern.
If they, so it might depend a bit on what the journal wants or what's typical for that journal. You could say, you know, we can provide translations of these, you know, excerpts or whatever on request, or we can provide the original, or you might, you know, if you're using, for example, if you're using interview data and you've got selected quotations in English that you want to illustrate some point, you could, in a footnote, you could have the original language for the quote, so they can see how the translation was done. You can explicitly explain in the method section how you translated and why you chose to do it that way, or why you chose to do it at that point. I'm not sure there's a perfect answer. I suppose that's what I'm trying to say. I've certainly seen lots of papers where the interviews were conducted in other languages, and all the illustrative quotations and stuff were provided in English, and they just said translations were done by the authors. They didn't even actually say when the translation was done. I think, though, from memory, when I've read things, they've said, you know, they must have done it in the original language, and then they've just translated excerpts when they wanted to include an illustrative quotation. And I think that was probably related to the time taken to translate interview transcripts. So they probably saved the time in translation just for the bits of text that they wanted to reproduce in the article itself.
All right. Thank you, Professor.
That's all right.
Okay. Do we have time for, I think I see two more questions, Susan?
Solve that condition. Sorry, conditional how to collaborate both off-driven and based experience. Sorry, I think I've missed one. Retno.
So,
style and typical between reviewer and supervisor different. Yeah, how to solve that condition or how to collaborate. Yep, okay. So would you be dealing with the reviewer and the supervisor at the same time, would be my question. So this is about, I think it's about how to deal with conflicting advice or requirements from a reviewer and a supervisor. Is that right? Retno?
yes. Mbak Retno, are you still here? Do you want to?
Hello, Prof.
Hi. Hi.
Yeah, thank you very much, Prof. Mbak Kanti, thank you. Prof, your forecast is correct one, because sometimes I got information from the supervisor, Retno, you no need change. Example part 1, no need change. But after we, how to say, send to the reviewer said it have to change. That's confused for me because I'm a student, yeah.
Yeah, so is your supervisor on the paper with you?
Yes.
Okay, so it's in their interest then for you to do what the reviewer wants, if at all possible.
Okay.
So then if it's about getting the paper published because there's that new requirement of getting a paper out in the 12 months and your supervisor's on the paper with you, then I think they should understand that in order to get the paper published, it's probably a good idea to follow the advice of the reviewer as far as possible, or explain why, and be really sure if you're not going to follow the advice of the reviewer, have a very, very robust defense for why you're not going to.
Oh, okay, understood,
Yeah.
Prof. Understood, very clear.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
So I think I've missed.
Yes,
from
one
your
last
perspective,
question.
what distinguished?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. You can read it out loud. So when we upload the recording, people know the question as well.
Ah, Nicholas, from your perspective, what distinguished dissertation from among other researchers? So, not sure. So I'm not quite sure about what you're asking with this question.
What is distinctive about a dissertation compared
to other research? Okay. It depends a bit on your system at your institution. At Melbourne, we have a mix of styles. It's very confusing now. But anyway, I'll talk about the old-fashioned style. And this is the old-fashioned style that both myself and Kanti went through. which is still current. I've had two PhD students submit their thesis in the last 8 weeks, and one did it the old style and one did it the new style. So they're still current. So a dissertation, it's the scale of it. So a dissertation is going to be a very significant piece of work. It's going to be the equivalent of a book in terms of its scope. So it's the one time you have to really go in depth and spend a number of years researching the same thing. And I know when you're a PhD student, supervisors and other people say to you, you know, you're complaining now, but you have to understand that you'll look back on this time and you'll realize how lucky you were to have all this time to concentrate on the one thing. And you don't want to hear that. You just do not want to hear that, despite the fact that it's true. But so you know, our thesis at Melbourne is between 80 to 100,000 words. A journal article is probably, you know, 8 to 10,000 words. So you get a sense of a different scale. So you get a chance to go into a lot more depth. You get a chance to really explain and explore. You get a chance to do a much broader research project. You're not constrained as much by word limits. Yeah, so that's my answer to that. I hope that's okay.
Yes, although we also need to remember a thesis is not a Nobel Prize. Somebody wrote an article with that title.
Thesis is not a Nobel Prize. No, yeah. It's not a Nobel Prize. No. It needs to do the job of thesis.
Yeah.
That's what it needs to do. Because if you're too perfectionist, you will never finish. You won't let it go. It needs to look like a thesis and do the job of a thesis. And it's a thesis, right? And then you can go on. You can publish from your work. You can publish from your thesis. You can go on. You can build on it.
Okay.
Yeah, very true.
Okay. Oh wow! I think
so.
Run out of questions.
Do we have any other questions?
I don't think so. I don't see any. Anybody wants to ask one final question before we close the session? Okay, I think yeah, I think that's about it. Susan, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I think now we have reached the end of our seminar, our guest lecture. Thank you so much once again to Professor Susan Ainsworth.
You're very welcome.
Your insightful presentation, and to everyone here for such intriguing questions, and discussions. So let's give a big round of applause for Susan. Or maybe just give a thumb, or virtually.
Thank you.
I will now hand over back to Safura. Is Safura here?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, over to you, Safura. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Susan and Bu Kanti, for the amazing presentation and sharing session. Ladies and gentlemen, it is the time to part ways. On behalf of the organizing committee, I would like to say thank you and express my most gratitude for your enthusiastic participation through questions or comments live or in the chat box. A quick note, if you want to keep in touch, you can follow us on Instagram at cops.research and at ppim@poe. And let's give a final big round of applause to all of you, and also my apologies for any inconvenience. I
Okay.
am Zafura, Master of Ceremony today's event, signing off. Please stay safe, healthy, and always curious. See you on our future events. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Have a great evening, everybody.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Safura.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Mbak Kanti.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you, Nadia.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you, Mbak Kanti. Makasih ya, Mbak.
Sama-sama, makasih.
Izin leave.
Okay. Have a good evening, or maybe it's already night there.
Night.
And bye. Makasih,
Yes. Oh,
Buya.
it's all right. I'll have a cup of tea. I'll have
Time
a
for
cup of
dinner?
tea
Oh,
and do the washing up. I'll have a cup of tea and do the washing up.
okay, take
Lovely.
care.
Thanks. See you,
Take care,
everyone.
everyone.
Thanks. See you. Bye.
Assalamualaikum. Bye.
Waalaikumsalam.